now concluding on some famous textual problems by looking at the other lengthy, dubious passage, Mark chapter 16, verses 9 through 20. We've already looked at the story of the woman caught in adultery, which also involves 12 verses, and now we'll look at this most famous textual problem. The question that we're asking here is, when the end is not the end. Is this really the end of the gospel, or is the gospel ending at verse 8, or does it not have an ending? A really fundamental issue here is the ending of Mark's gospel lost forever? So we're going to look at the conclusion to Mark's gospel, and you'll be surprised to learn that it's not just these two endings that we have, verse 8 and verse 20. There are other ways in which this gospel has ended. 5 different ways in which the gospel has concluded. And the first of these is the one that ends just at verse 8. So the question we want to ask is, which one, if any of these, actually concluded the gospel? And so the first ending is what we also call the short ending, or the SE. That's when the gospel ends at chapter 16, verse 8. Then they, that is Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, went out and ran from the tomb, for terror and bewilderment had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid, period. The women who were supposed to tell the disciples to meet Jesus in Galilee, that he had risen from the dead, are afraid, and they say nothing. All the way through this gospel, you've got demons who want to speak and people who want to speak, and Jesus tells them to be silent. And these people who get healed go and spread the news about Jesus, making it more and more difficult for him to do the kind of ministry that he intended to do. So all the way through this gospel, people are speaking about him when he forbids them to. Now these women are commanded to, and they are silent. We have irony in the end, if this is how the gospel actually does end. Then there's the intermediate ending, which most of you have never seen before. But they reported briefly to Peter and those with him all that they had been told. And after these things, Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. There are some manuscripts that end the gospel with this. And so you have implicitly that Jesus sees these guys, he's raised from the dead. Of course, you already have that in the short ending, but they see him in his post-resurrection state, and he commissions them to spread the gospel. It's a fairly colorless ending. In fact, it's a very colorless ending, but we do have it in some manuscripts, and it'll loom large later as we begin to think about these issues. In some of these manuscripts, the intermediate ending is followed by the long ending. So you have not just verse 8, but that intermediate ending that doesn't even have verse numbers. Then the long ending, which is what we traditionally know here, which is verses 9 through 20. Early on the first day of the week, after he arose, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had driven out 7 demons. Interesting that Mary Magdalene has to be introduced again when she was already introduced earlier in the passage. She went out and told those who were with him while they were mourning and weeping. And when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they did not believe. After this, he appeared in a different form to 2 of them while they were on their way to the country. This sounds really reminiscent of Luke 24, the road to Emmaus. They went back and told the rest, but they did not believe them. Then he appeared to the 11 themselves while they were eating, and he rebuked them for their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they did not believe those who had seen him resurrected. He said to them, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. The one who believes and is baptized will be saved, but the one who does not believe will be condemned." And now we get the verses that are the most controversial, that most Christians today would say, I really wish that Mark 16, 9 through 20 is not authentic. I hope it's not authentic, because I don't like these verses at all. And I'm going to show you what's happened historically with these verses, that the opinion that some Christians have today is not at all what the ancient church thought. Verse 17, these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name they will drive out demons. They will speak in new languages. They will pick up snakes with their hands, and whatever poison they drink will not harm them. They will place their hands on the sick, and they will be well. After the Lord Jesus had spoken to them, he was taken up into heaven, and he sat down at the right hand of God. They went out and proclaimed everywhere, while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the word through the accompanying signs. It's verses 17 and 18 especially that are problematic for a lot of Christians. Now, in one manuscript, but several more known to Jerome, we have what's known as the freer logion It's wedged in between verses 14 and 15. This is found today only in Codex W, or the manuscript that Charles Freer purchased in 1906, the manuscript that's at the Smithsonian Institution. And they excuse themselves, saying, "This age of lawlessness and unbelief is under Satan, who does not allow the truth and power of God to prevail over the unclean things of the spirits. Therefore, reveal your righteousness now." Thus they spoke to Christ. And Christ replied to them, "The term of years of Satan's power has been fulfilled, but other terrible things draw near. And for those who have sinned, I was handed over to death, that they may return to the truth and sin no more, in order that they may inherit the spiritual and incorruptible glory of righteousness that is in heaven." Well, let me just summarize the external evidence for these various 5 endings. 3 can be eliminated: the intermediate ending followed by the long ending, and the freer logion between verses 14 and 15 of the long ending. Those 3 endings, we don't have sufficient support to say that they have a good possibility of being viable, of going back to the original. It does leave 2 endings, the short ending and the long ending. And these have always been the 2 that have been debated as to which one is authentic. But there's a fundamental question that we have to ask that's related to the internal evidence, and we'll be keeping this in mind as we go through the manuscripts too. Which is more likely, that scribes would intentionally omit verses 9 through 20, or that they would intentionally add these verses? Is it more likely that a scribe would say, "These 12 verses offend me, so I'm going to cut them out"? Or, "This gospel ends without a resurrection appearance by Jesus to his disciples, so I'm going to add them"? Now, frankly, if verses 17 and 18 were not in here, the decision would be a whole lot easier. But with 17 and 18, now it raises some interesting wrinkles. But why would a scribe be interested in cutting out all 12 verses? If that causes some offense to ancient Christians, wouldn't they just cut out those 2 verses and keep the rest? It doesn't make much sense, but we'll look at this. Okay, arguments for the long ending. In terms of the external evidence, at least 95% of all manuscripts, versions, and fathers have the long ending. That is huge. I mean, that's a lot. But we've said all along, we do not count manuscripts, we weigh them. It's also found as early as the late 4th or early 5th century in Codex W. We're not sure exactly the date of that manuscript. Codex Washingtonianus, also known as the Freer manuscript at the Smithsonian. It's the earliest manuscript that we have that has it. It's found in all 3 text forms, the Byzantine, Western, and Alexandria in the later Alexandrian manuscripts. So it's got wide geographical distribution. And it's found in the Fathers, early in the Fathers, beginning no later than the late 2nd century with Irenaeus. So when you look at the external evidence, the geographical distribution is widespread. The genealogical solidarity in at least 2 of the text types, the Byzantine and the Western, is there. The date and character, not as good. It's not nearly as good as the other side, but at least it's good. So now, then I start thinking about this in terms of the internal evidence and combining this with the external. Why would these verses be omitted by scribes? Was it embarrassment over verses 17 and 18? This is the standard thing that you get people that argue for the long ending. They say scribes would have been embarrassed by that, especially in the Alexandrian tradition, and so they excised all 12 verses because of 2 verses that embarrassed them. That just makes no sense. But then you look at the patristic evidence, and now that argument is seen to be completely baseless. At least 10 fathers quote from or allude to verses 15 to 20, the second half of this pericope, in a steady stream from the 2nd to the 5th century, while no fathers mention the first half of the pericope, verses 9 through 14, until the 4th century. What this means is the part of this text that was known and appreciated was the one that talked about the snakes. The part of the text that was not as well known or not as well appreciated is the first half of this that doesn't. So the very text that today causes some Christians to be offended is the very passage that the church fathers had no problems with. So whatever we think about today, that's not the concerns that they had back then. The evidence reveals that the fathers did not have a problem with verses 17 and 18. Now, some arguments for the short ending. Scribes would be strongly tempted to add a resurrection appearance to this gospel. Why would they be tempted to do that? because in chapter 8, verse 31, 9, verse 9, 9:31, and 10:34, Jesus predicts his own resurrection 4 times. Well, you predict it 4 times. By the end of the gospel, was he raised from the dead? Well, surely he was. The angels announced that. But we expect to see him raised from the dead as well. This is the only gospel that doesn't have a resurrection appearance by Jesus to the disciples. And that's if we ended at verse 8. Years ago, many years ago, about 20 years ago, there was a majority text scholar who was speaking at a concert. And the concert was a huge one at the American Airlines Center in Dallas. About 20,000 people were there. And he was promoting a translation. I won't tell you what the name of it is, but it's a modern translation based on the same text as the King James, so you could probably figure this one out. But he was telling this audience that were just frothing at the mouth, believing anything that somebody gets hyped about, don't use these modern translations because they're based on ancient corrupt manuscripts that at the end of Mark's gospel don't even have Jesus being raised from the dead. Well, that's just not true. They don't have Jesus being seen by his disciples as raised from the dead. And I talked to the fellow later, and I said, that was a horrible thing to say. It was a misrepresentation, and it wasn't accurate. He didn't do it on purpose, but his familiarity with what these early manuscripts had to say was just really paltry, and he did a terrible misrepresentation before 20,000 people who wanted to go out and burn their modern Bibles after that. That's just not responsible. This is the only gospel that doesn't have a resurrection appearance by Jesus, but it still has the resurrection, and that is crucial to remember. Well, what manuscripts lack it? Codex Sinaiticus, the one that Tischendorf discovered, 4th century, doesn't have this passage. Codex Vaticanus, 4th century, doesn't have this passage. We have no papyri on this passage. So our earliest manuscripts are these two. These 2 manuscripts, when they agree, the reading goes back deep into the 2nd century and probably back to the original in most cases. They're the best witnesses to the most important text type, the Alexandrian. And one of the things to note about these is you get guys like Dean Bergen who said, there are 3,000 differences in the Gospels between these 2 manuscripts. How can we possibly say that they're reliable? Well, he's completely missed the point. It's because of all those differences that shows that they did not copy from a common ancestor that was 1 generation removed. It must be several generations removed, and they are reliable when they agree. When they disagree, then all bets are off. But these 2 manuscripts, when they agree, that goes back very, very early, probably 10 generations or more, back deep into the 2nd century. Here's what Codex Vaticanus has at the end. It's got a blank column, an entire blank column. You've got the Gospel of Mark ending in column 2, and then in column 3, it actually doesn't say Codex Vaticanus there. It says, I put that in the slide, but this blank column at the end of Mark in Codex Vaticanus is the only blank column in the New Testament for this manuscript of Codex B. Does this indicate that the scribe knew of the long ending and was making room for it? Well, it's quite unlikely because there's simply not enough room for the long ending. As somebody found out years ago, as a majority text guy, he says, well, let's write out the letters in the size that Codex B would have done this. He says, there's not nearly enough room to put this in here. And he switched from being a majority text after that. It's also unlikely that this is what the scribe was doing because there are 3 Old Testament leaves that have a blank column, and they are all at the end of a genre, like the end of poetry moving into prose, or the end of prose moving into poetry, something like that. And I suggest that that's exactly the same thing that we have in Codex Vaticanus for this passage. I'm suggesting that B's archetype had Mark at the end of the 4 Gospels. What a radical suggestion. I'm just saying that out of the blue. There's no basis whatsoever because, of course, we have no manuscripts that are like that, right? Of course we do. Remember the Western order of the Gospels? Matthew, John, Luke, Mark. The Apostles first, Mark last. We have it in Codex D, we have it in Codex W, and several others that I didn't mention. J.K. Elliott, the New Testament textual critic from Britain, a very fine scholar, said he believes the order of the Gospels, the first time they would have been put into a codex would have been the Western order. And I have a strong suspicion that the archetype of Codex Vaticanus had it in the Western order. In other words, what this scribe is he's following the text of the manuscripts in front of him, but he now has changed the order of the Gospels, but still keeps that same thing in the text, which is to have a blank column at the very end. In other words, if you have Matthew, John, Luke, Mark, the next book is going to be the book of Acts. It's a different genre. Now, what evidence do I have besides just saying that it could happen that way, and the fact that we have 3 Old Testament parallels that have a different genre? The evidence is that in Paul's letters, you have material that is kind of paragraphs that are numbered, and they are in a different order than the archetype. In other words, what you have in Vaticanus is the numbering of these letters of paragraphs within these books that is different. It's out of order. One of the books got misplaced. It got put in the front and when it should have been put in the back, which shows that whatever he's copying had a different order for those books, and he's keeping the same numbering system. He's that close to the copy he's copying, but he changes it in terms of the order of the books. He's changing the order of the books in Paul's letters. He's changing the order of the books in the Gospels too, I think. But he still keeps the same formatting of having a blank column at the end of the book. That's what I'm trying to argue. So if that's the case, that suggests why he would have this blank column. It has nothing to do with thinking about the long ending. There's certainly not enough room for it. It has everything to do with the fact that in the original text of Vaticanus that he's copied from, Acts would have come after Mark, and that's going to be very significant to think about what's going on in the relationship of these two. Now, Codex Sinaiticus doesn't have a complete blank column at the end. It's got mostly a blank column, but so not too much has been made about that. But if the blank column in B indicates that the scribe was aware of the long ending, then what does the blank page at the end of the Gospels in Sinaiticus indicate? That's what you have there. So some people make a lot of stuff out of this one and go, wait a minute, I'm looking at the text here. This is a blank page. Oh yeah, there's a whole other book here that's supposed to belong that we didn't know about. Just you get some silly notions here. Well, not only do we have that evidence for these 2 oldest manuscripts, but the oldest Syriac, Armenian, Georgian, and Sahidic manuscripts in the Gospel at verse 8. And the Syriac Sinaitic, which is a very important manuscript, the text form is from the 2nd century. It ends it at verse 8, and they represent early and widespread distribution. Origen and Clement, 2nd and 3rd century fathers, are silent about any material after verse 8. It doesn't mean they don't know about it, but certainly they can't be used as evidence that they do. Eusebius, early 4th century, very important scholar, because he was commissioned by Constantine to create 50 Bibles, and he has access to the Bibles in the East. And here he says, the accurate copies of the Gospel of Mark conclude the story, according to Mark, in the words, they were afraid, for the end is here in nearly all the copies of Mark. Notice the 2 points that he's making. Quantitatively, the most manuscripts that he's seen end at verse 8. Qualitatively, the accurate copies end at verse 8. So it's a double whammy. And Eusebius would know, because he took over the library that Origen had in Caesarea and had a massive shop there with assistants that were creating these Bibles for Constantine. He had access to some very, very important manuscripts. Then at the end of the 4th century, beginning of the 5th, Jerome, now he's got access to manuscripts, especially in the West, because he is writing the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate, based on cleaning up all these old Latin manuscripts that went all over the place. He's got behind him the backing of the Vatican. Eusebius had the backing of Constantine. Jerome has the backing of the Pope. And here he says that the long ending is found in scarcely any copies of the Gospel, almost all the Greek codices being without the passage. Now, Jerome is making an advance over Eusebius, and he's hinting at something. He is saying, he adds one word here that is crucial, Greek. Jerome is saying the Greek manuscripts don't have this passage. Almost none of them do. And then he says it's scarcely in any copies, but it suggests that maybe this passage is in some other manuscripts, probably the Latin ones, and I suspect that's where this passage actually started from. What's interesting is then you go about 150, 200 years later, and here's what you see. Victor of Antioch, he is the most popular commentary on Mark's gospel in the Middle Ages. He wrote the most popular commentary, and he says that both endings were in wide circulation in his day. But he believed that the longer ending was more accurate. So you go 100 years later, now we've got somebody who says, oh, by the way, the long ending is accurate, or 200 years later. Victor wrote the most popular commentary on Mark in the Middle Ages. It was used widely, and it may well have been due to his influence that scribes added the long ending from then on. What I'm telling you is this. You go through the first 5 centuries, the long ending hardly appears in any manuscripts, according to Eusebius and Jerome, who had access to manuscripts on the east and the west. How in the world did that text become in the majority? Well, it's a strong impulse on the part of the scribes to put something there because you don't have any resurrection appearances by Jesus. And the long ending is what ultimately emerged to the top, especially, most likely, because of Victor of Antioch. And so we've got historical reasons for seeing this. We've got some alternative endings, and these are very difficult to explain if that long ending was originally there. Codex Bobiensis has the intermediate ending, which is colorless. If the long ending was known to the scribe, why would he omit it and use instead a very bland ending? Several manuscripts and versions from the 4th to the 9th century have the intermediate ending before the long ending. None of them have it after the long ending. If they had it after the long ending, it would show that their manuscripts that they're copying from had the long ending and they're adding the intermediate ending. If they have the intermediate ending and then the long one, it shows that they've come across the long one after the intermediate ending was already in that text. And so all this evidence really suggests something that Bruce Metzger has summarized very capably when he says that no one who had available as the conclusion of the second gospel, the 12 verses 9 through 20, so rich in interesting material, would have deliberately replaced them with a few lines of a colorless and generalized summary. You also have marginal notes in these manuscripts, which are fascinating, even in many of the manuscripts that do have the long ending. There's a note that registers suspicion. It says, the end, at verse 8. In some copies, the evangelist ended here, but in many, this also, and then it goes on and gives verses 9 through 20. Others have, Eusebius canonized the gospel to here. He recognized this as scripture to verse 8. After that, there's more. These same manuscripts that have verses 9 through 20 are registering their suspicion about those 12 verses. Others have asterisks after verse 8 that indicate doubt about its authenticity. So you can't just say 95% of the manuscripts have it. Let's examine those manuscripts. Let's examine the versions. Let's examine the church fathers. Let's see what the data actually reveal, and we see an entirely different picture than that. Why does this gospel, and only this gospel, have major textual upheaval at the end? It's because scribes were uncomfortable with the gospel ending without any resurrection appearances. That seems to make the most sense by far. If Mark 16, 9 through 20 were original, then why would the material be deleted? Why don't any manuscripts delete the endings of Matthew, Luke, or John? This one. And if the material was offensive, why wouldn't they just delete verses 17 and 18? So to conclude the external evidence, but I've really brought in the internal as well, the manuscripts, versions, and patristic writings on behalf of the short ending at verse 8, are early and widespread. They represent the Alexandrian, Western, Caesarean, and Byzantine text types. The short ending is found in the best witnesses of the 3 most important early versions, Latin, Coptic, and Syriac, as well as the best and earliest witnesses of the Armenian and Georgian. We're comparing the best and the earliest against the majority in each one of these cases. It's also found in the best witnesses of the Alexandrian, Caesarean, and Western texts. Eusebius and Jerome, whose access to manuscripts was vast, both affirmed that the short ending was by far the predominant conclusion to Mark in their day. And that right there, their 2 statements, is one of the strongest pieces of evidence as to why we cannot do textual criticism by counting noses. If we do that, we have to ask, when are you counting and what are you counting? When are you counting? Well, you're surely not counting in the 4th century, because if you just count in the 4th century, then the long ending is not going to be found in the majority of manuscripts. Or the 5th or 6th or 7th, it really becomes the majority in the 9th century. The reason for later manuscripts to have some ending after 16:8 is easily explainable. Scribal desire to have a resurrection appearance by Jesus to the disciples, while no convincing reason has been proposed as to why some scribes should eliminate these 12 verses. Now, I know a lot of the stuff I'm repeating over and over again because I want it to sink in. This is very important to think through some of these issues. Internally now, and this is where it gets to be fun, especially in the intrinsic evidence, is it likely that Mark wrote that? That's where we'll have a lot of fun with this. Both the transcriptional, that is the scribal, and intrinsic authorial evidence argue decisively against the authenticity of the long ending. We've seen that scribes would be more likely to add material after 16:8 than delete it, and intrinsically there's not a single passage in Mark 1:1 through 16:8 that's comparable to the stylistic, grammatical, and lexical anomalies that we find clustered in these 12 verses. There's no other pericope in all of Mark that has so many things that just don't fit Mark's style, his grammar, his vocabulary, his syntax, his themes, anything. It's really, really different from the rest of Mark. And the fellow who demonstrated this in an exhaustive way was Greg Sapah. He just finished his dissertation at Dallas Seminary, an appraisal of the intrinsic probability of the longer endings of the Gospel of Mark. And over and over and over and over again, he said, there's just no way that the long ending can be authentic. Well, now we come to a really fascinating question. I'm assuming that the long ending actually is not correct, and we're wrestling with what happened after 16:8. Did Mark intentionally end his gospel here, or is the real ending actually lost? People have used three arguments that the ending was lost. Those who don't think the long ending is authentic, they'll say, well, still the ending for Mark's gospel is lost. The first argument is the last leaf could have been lost if this was written on a codex. Remember, we've talked about that before. So a lot of things we've wrestled with this in this course, we're kind of summarizing again here for this last lecture. Books don't end in a gar. That's not the word yap, that's the word gar in Greek, or the word for. It's a conjunction for. And it's in what's called post-positive position. It's the very last word in Mark 16:8. The wording is ephobuntagar, for they were afraid. And the third argument is that open-ended conclusions are a modern Kafka-like invention. Well, really, is that the argument? But that's how it's used. Now, let me just give you some counter-arguments, and then I'll give you some final evidence, and we'll wrap this up. Mark's gospel would have been written on a roll, not a codex. We've talked about this before. Codex form was invented later. The end would be the most protected leaf of the entire manuscript. To assume that somehow that last leaf was lost, and it was lost so that Matthew and Luke had exactly the same copy of Mark that they're using, which was a codex, that's like a triple assumption that is astronomically impossible. Books have been discovered that, in fact, end in a gar, and open-ended conclusions are, in fact, ancient. They don't start with Kafka. And I give some evidence here. The roll versus the codex, Skeet and Roberts, in their book, The Birth of the Codex. Mark was written on a roll, not a codex. Books in and a gar. I mentioned the article by P.W. Vanderhorst and another one by Kelly Iverson, who wrote an article in CBQ. He was one of my interns, and this grew out of his master's thesis. And then the open-ended conclusions are ancient. Lee Magnus especially did this in his doctoral dissertation, Mark in the End, Sense and Absence in the Gospel of Mark, and he found it in Greco-Roman literature and Jewish literature. Several Old Testament passages are open-ended. Even a whole book, Jonah, ends this way. He's sitting under this tree complaining that the shade is gone, and the book just kind of ends. Well, maybe Mark is doing something there intentionally as well. And I take it that Mark is foreshadowing the ephobuntagar, the for they were afraid of 16:8, with the open-ended conclusion to the pericope of Jesus' third prediction about his resurrection in 9:32. In chapter 9:32, after he comes down from the Mount of Transfiguration, now he's with all of his disciples, and we read, but they did not understand this statement about the resurrection, and they were afraid to ask him. Ephobunta, exactly the same verb form, when a verb form can be in hundreds of different sizes, shapes and sizes in Greek, and it's exactly the same verb, exactly the same form. And here's what happens. This foreshadows Mark 16:8 in 5 ways. Mark 9:32 does. It deals with resurrection, the Jesus resurrection. The pericope is open-ended. This is the end of the pericope. Then it goes on to some other story. The verb is an imperfect tense, which in itself, by its very nature, is open-ended. For they were continually afraid, is the idea. Wait, tell us the rest of this, Mark. Nope, not going to do it. It's the same verb in the same form used in 16:8, and the pericope ends with the disciples bewildered, just like these women were. These parallels are uncanny, and I think Mark is giving us a clue that that's how he's going to end his gospel. So why did no one in the ancient world understand Mark's intention? That's what Keith Elliott asked me. He said, no scribe understood this. It's impossible, or virtually impossible, that Mark could have intended to end his gospel this way. I said, I think you're wrong. I think Luke understood it. Look at the conclusion to Acts. It's open-ended. You have Acts beginning with a bang, ending with a whimper. He starts out, man, the gospel's spreading, the Holy Spirit lands on the apostles' heads like fire, flames of fire. You get them speaking in tongues, doing miracles all the way through. People are getting martyred. The church is growing. And then you have 8 chapters waiting for Paul to come to trial. And he never does. Where did Luke get an idea to write so poorly? Ramsey said, no one can accept the ending of Acts as the conclusion of a rationally conceived history. Well, I think he's on to something. That was not meant to be the end of Acts. Luke meant for his readers to write the last chapter in their own lives. He seems to have a similar purpose to Mark. Get the reader involved in the narrative. You're reading along, you see Paul's in prison for 2 years. Roman law says you're going to come to trial really soon. And Luke, I think, is writing this as a trial brief for Theophilus to get Paul out of prison, but for a broader audience to say, what are you going to do with the gospel? Are you going to share the gospel too, or are you just going to sit idly by? Acts starts with a bang, ends with a whimper, leaving the reader wanting more and having to get involved. Does Luke give any other clues that he's emulating Mark's literary style? Mark ends it open-ended. I think Luke does, and I think the beginning of Acts shows this too. At the beginning of Acts, Luke says, I wrote the former account, Theophilus, about all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day he was taken up to heaven. The Gospels are the beginning of what Jesus is doing and teaching. He's continuing that in the apostles, and the apostles continue that in their converts. In fact, we are continuing the story of Acts, and that's why there is an Acts 29 group today. Well, you compare that to the beginning of Mark. He opens his gospel with the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Often the first line in an ancient book was meant to be the title. I take it that that's the case here. And if this is the beginning of the gospel, his whole gospel is the beginning of the gospel, he's giving us a clue. I'm not going to end it. Mark 9:32, I'm going to do something that's open-ended. Luke picks up on this, and he spoke of his gospel as the beginning of what Jesus did, and Acts continues the narrative, but he leaves off for the reader to get engaged in the spreading of the gospel. So Mark and Luke Acts are similar, and Luke understood Mark's purpose. I take it that Mark has got a goal here of getting the reader to step into the sandals of the disciples and answer the question for himself or herself, what are you going to do with Jesus? Do you accept him in his suffering? If so, you get to see him in his glory. If you don't, you don't. So by way of conclusion, although at first glance the evidence is overwhelming on behalf of the long ending, a more penetrating analysis reveals that the earliest and best manuscripts and versions with the greatest geographical spread, the comments by Eusebius and Jerome about the majority of manuscripts in their day ending at verse 8, the multitude of endings before or in place of the long ending, the marginal notes in the manuscripts complaining about the long ending, and the overwhelming evidence from the linguistic uniqueness of this passage all argue that Mark ended his gospel at 16:8. And why does he complete his gospel this way? It's an invitation to the reader. Mark's challenge to his readers in his day is still valid today. What are you going to do with Jesus? And that's what we need to ask ourselves every day. Thank you again for your attention.